The fog settles over the hills like a memory no one dares revisit. Somewhere in the folds of forgotten Eastern Europe lies a crumbling manor house, its windows blind with grime, its gates choked by thorns. It's the kind of place that doesn't appear on maps anymore, a husk of nobility lost to rot. Once, the halls echoed with laughter, music, and the rustle of silk gowns. But the walls remember more than joy. They remember screams. In the attic of this ruined estate hangs a portrait. Time has chewed at the canvas, but the image is still clear. A young bride, her veil thin as mist, her cheeks suspiciously flushed, look closer to flushed, bruised, in fact. Her eyes do not sparkle, they do not weep, they simply endure. We like to think of weddings as sacred beginnings, vows whispered through trembling smiles, petals tossed like blessings. But what if a wedding began with violence? What if cruelty wasn't the end of love, but its opening act? This isn't fiction. For centuries, in hidden corners of aristocratic Europe, a strange and disturbing ritual unfolded before noble weddings. Brides, often just girls, were beaten deliberately, ritually, sometimes by the very families who dressed them in lace. Some were whipped, others slapped or struck with rods, and it wasn't hidden, it was sanctioned, accepted, even praised as tradition. Why? Historians argue. Some trace it to medieval superstition, a belief that pain would drive out the demons of disobedience, protect fertility, or ward off misfortune. Others point to patriarchy distilled into its purest form, where a woman's body had to be broken to be made ready. Still others whisper of darker truths, control, sadism, a legacy of cruelty masquerading as culture. There is no single answer, only fragments, only echoes, in the borderlands of Romania, in Polish courts, among Balkan nobility stories surface. Like bones in thawing ground, the accounts are scattered, often oral, preserved in hushed tones by descendants ashamed or mystified by what their ancestors endured. One tale survives in the memoirs of a 19th century governess stationed in Wallachia. She writes of a bride-to-be, barely 16, who stood in a lace-trimmed chemise while her aunt beat her legs with birch branches. The girl did not cry. She had been taught not to. The beating was called a cleansing, a softening, a way to prepare her for her husband's corrections. Afterwards, she was bathed in milk and wrapped in silk. At the wedding feast, no one spoke of it again. Another account, from an Austrian folklorist writing in 1892, describes the ritual as symbolic submission. A bride kneeling at her husband's feet, accepting a slap to the face in front of witnesses. If she flinched, she was called unready. If she bled, it was seen as auspicious proof that her strength had been taken into the marriage. What kind of world creates such logic? And more disturbingly, what kind of world forgets it? Today, these stories have all but vanished from textbooks. They don't fit our narrative of romantic courtship or noble refinement. But the silence doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means we have chosen to look away. But history waits. In manor houses with rotting tapestries, in paintings of veiled brides with haunted eyes, in legends whispered through cracked family trees. And now we choose to look again. This was no isolated event. It was a ritual that crossed borders, transcended kingdoms, and lasted longer than we care to admit. Not all noble weddings included it, but enough did to stain the pages of history with something darker than ink. The story begins here, in silence, in shadow, in that blurred space where ritual becomes abuse and love is tangled with domination. Before we can understand how such cruelty became custom, we must walk through the snow-covered corridors of Europe's aristocracy. we must see the world that birthed such a tradition. A world obsessed with bloodlines, obedience, and control, because only then can we begin to ask the question no one wants to answer: how much pain can be hidden beneath a wedding veil? They called it tradition. In the snow-choked corners of Eastern Europe, between the 16th and 18th centuries, the wedding season came with frostbite and firewood, and with bruises, the villagers, scattered across the bloodlands regions that now form parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Romania, were isolated by forest and war. Here, time didn't flow so much as it froze. Customs, no matter how cruel, ossified into law. And among them was this: before the white veil, there was the black eye. In many of these communities, weddings were not merely social celebrations. They were sacred transactions, family's transfer of its most valuable possession, a daughter, young, fertile, obedient, and to make her so, the family believed, she needed to be broken in. The beating of the bride wasn't always public. Sometimes it happened quietly, in a barn or basement, with only female relatives present. In other villages, it was a grotesque ritual masked as festivity. Drums would pound, men would drink, and in the frenzy, the bride, barely more than a child, was led to the center of the gathering. There, in front of neighbors, friends, and potential in-laws, she might be slapped, whipped, or forced to kneel for hours as relatives hurled ash or spat wine at her face. The justification, purification, humbling, a final test before the vows records. From ethnographies who traveled through the Carpathians and beyond in the 18th and 19th centuries describe these events in sparse but chilling terms. A Russian scholar writing in 1783 noted that in some regions of Ruthenia, a father would lash his daughter's back with willow switches on the morning of her wedding. It was believed that this drove out childish spirits' immaturity, pride. Disobedience and allowed the soul of a true wife to enter. In parts of Moldova, the bride's hair was braided tightly and then pulled with sudden force until her eyes watered. So she learns, a grandmother was recorded saying that tears are part of marriage. It was folklore and fatalism mixed together. Women who didn't cry at their own weddings were considered cold or arrogant, bad omens. In this view, tears weren't weakness. They were a rite of passage. Many of the brides were 15. Some were younger. One oral history, recorded in the early 20th century from a Novanisht Bukovinian hamlet, tells of a girl named Katerina. She was the baker's daughter's slender, quiet, and obedient, like they all were trained to be. Her wedding day arrived with sleet and drunken celebration. The bridegroom's family insisted on the test. Katerina was struck once, then again her mother stood by, weeping, holding a loaf of bread in her hands. It was tradition. The bread was to be broken and shared after the blows. The lesson, pain, then sustenance, Katerina, passed the test. She did not scream, she married. She died 2 years later in childbirth. Her mother kept the cracked ceremonial plate for the rest of her life. The logic, if we can call it that, came from the strange collision between pagan endurance trials and Christian concepts of original sin. In Slavic folklore, pain had a purifying power. Women, associated with earth, cycles, and mystery, were seen as needing to be tamed. Christianity amplified the narrative by layering on the guilt of Eve. The idea that a woman must suffer to be worthy of her role as wife and mother. By the 17th century, church sermons in rural villages sometimes reinforced these ideas. One Polish preacher wrote, Just as Christ was scourged before he rose, so must a girl be chastened before she can be reborn in the Holy Covenant. The metaphor was not lost on the villagers, who treated marriage like a crucifixion followed by resurrection, a new name, a new household, a new burden. Not every beating left visible scars. Some were symbolic: a sharp tug of the ear, a slap with a glove, a freezing cold foot bath to numb the senses. These milder rituals, too, came with warnings whispered into the bride's ear. Better you learn from us than from him. Meaning, if your family doesn't teach you suffering, your husband surely will. And that is perhaps the most devastating part. These acts weren't always done with malice. Often they were cloaked in love, twisted by fear. Families believed they were preparing their daughters for the inevitable violence of marriage in a patriarchal world. Better to cry today, the thinking went, than to rebel tomorrow. Better bruised than divorced. Better shamed than dead. But even in those days, some voices dared to dissent. A 1762 village priest in Transylvania wrote a letter condemning the heathen cruelty practiced in bridal rites. His warnings were ignored. He was transferred to a distant parish the following year. These traditions did not end suddenly. They withered slowly as roads connected villages and new ideas began to creep in with traveling merchants and reformist priests. By the mid-19th century, many such rituals faded, replaced by westernized ceremonies. White gowns and romantic songs borrowed from foreign lands. But in some places, the memory lingers. Old women still whisper of their grandmother's bruises. A cracked porcelain plate sits behind a cupboard. A stained wedding cloth is buried in the back of a drawer. Pain, once sacred, now sits silent. And yet, the question remains, why did they believe it was necessary at all? That answer lies not only in ritual, but in power. And that's where we go next. They called it a lesson, a rite of passage, a preparation in the cold language of churchmen and elders. The act of striking a bride was never framed as cruelty, it was framed as necessity. The logic, twisted though it was, had centuries of scripture, tradition, and authority behind it. Pain, they believed, was instructive, fear, foundational, and obedience, the highest virtue a woman could possess. To become a wife, a woman had to be trained not just in domestic skills, but in spiritual endurance. And that training, in many Eastern European communities, began with her body. Religious texts of the early modern period were saturated with metaphors of suffering. Christ bore the cross. Saints were flayed, starved, beheaded, burned. These were not merely historical events, they were models for holy living. To suffer was to be sanctified, and women already deemed weaker, more impressionable, more prone to sin were taught to suffer with special grace. The Church, though rarely explicit in endorsing beatings, laid the groundwork. Sermons repeated the Pauline doctrine: wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, as unto the Lord. Marriage was not a partnership, it was a hierarchy, ordained by God. Just as the Church was subject to Christ, the wife was subject to her husband. To rebel was not only improper, it was blasphemous. In this theological framework, pain served a sacred function. The bridal beating became a distorted echo of Christ's passion. Just as he had suffered to cleanse the sins of mankind, the bride's suffering was said to cleanse her of earthly impurity. The bruises became a kind of holy offering, proof that she was ready to leave behind girlhood, pleasure, and vanity. She was dying to her former self. Some ceremonies even mimicked religious rituals. In one documented village custom in 17th century, Wallachia, a bride was led barefoot to a small altar in her home. There, before icons of saints, she was slapped 3 times across the face by her mother or grandmother, symbolically driving out pride. In another case from Moldavia, the groom's family would whip the bride lightly on the back with willow branches, declaring it the blessing of Eve. These practices were not hidden. They were communal, witnessed, expected. Girls knew what was coming. Some cried, some begged, others, resigned, accepted it as fate. To resist would only bring shame, or worse, accusations of rebellion. And yet the paradox of it all was this: the more a bride endured, the more she was praised. Local tales from the Carpathians speak of women who did not flinch during the ritual slap. They were said to make the best wives silent, composed, God-fearing. A single tear was permitted, even admired. But to scream, to run, to raise a hand in defense, that was seen as proof of weakness or wickedness. Church records show how priests reinforced these ideals during premarital counseling. One 18th century clerical handbook instructed confessors to remind brides of their obligation to meekness, comparing their wedding vows to a nun's spiritual death to the world. Just as the veil falls over the bride, it read, so too must silence fall over her voice, pride over her will, and obedience over her heart. It was not just about control, it was about reshaping identity. Pain was not incidental, it was symbolic. The bride was expected to pass through suffering the way one passes through fire, purified, quieted, altered. The bruises faded, but the lesson endured. She learned when to speak, when not to, how to endure her husband's temper, how to hide her own. She learned how to disappear, piece by piece, in order to be praised. Behind the altar and the lace, then, stood a chilling truth. The bridal beating was not an anomaly. It was the shadow behind the sacrament, the price of admission into respectable womanhood. And yet, the people inflicting these rituals often believed they were helping. A mother who raised her hand against her daughter might whisper, "You'll understand one day." A groom who struck his bride might believe he was showing her the world's hard edges before the world did worse. It was not kindness, but it was not always hatred either. It was submission dressed as tradition, and ancient machinery grinding on because no one dared stop it. Over time, these rites would begin to erode under the pressure of modernity. Enlightenment philosophers questioned the Church's hold on private life. Legal reforms gave women slivers of autonomy. But even as formal laws changed, the psychological scaffolding remained. Obedience as virtue, silence as safety, pain as proof. The legacy lingered in subtle forms in wedding customs, in household dynamics, in quiet expectations passed from mother to daughter. And in some villages, the slap endured well into the 20th century, a relic of a lesson no longer spoken aloud, but still deeply felt. As the world around them modernized, these women bore memories they rarely named. They smiled in photographs, they kissed their children goodnight, and sometimes, just before sleep, they touched the spot where the first lesson was taught not in words, but in bruises. Next, we turn our attention to the strange rituals of proof ceremonies, where blood and bedsheets, not love, decided a bride's worth in the dim salons of aristocratic Europe, where chandeliers glinted over marble floors and orchestras played in hushed corners. Violence wore a velvet glove. Among the nobility, marriage was not the culmination of love, it was a chess move, a calculation of bloodlines, dowries, treaties, and dynastic power. And within this cold arithmetic, the bride was a token, her pain a symbol, her obedience a requirement, her suffering a tradition. What had begun in the mud-thick villages of Eastern Europe, the bridal beating did not vanish as one climbed the social ladder. It evolved. Among the peasantry, a daughter might be whipped behind closed doors to ensure chastity. Among royals, she was broken quietly, elegantly, sometimes in public, sometimes in shadow, but always with purpose. One 17th-century court document from Hungary describes a noble bride disciplined on the morning of her wedding by her future husband's aunt as a symbol of loyalty to her new house. The blows were light, almost ceremonial, but the message was clear. You are no longer your own. Other times, the spectacle was far more sinister. In the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, certain aristocratic families carried out formal rituals in which the bride was escorted to her grooms, a state only to be softened through isolation, fasting, and even physical punishment administered by older women of the household. This was not called cruelty. It was called tradition. It was said to prepare her spirit, to cut the ties of girlhood. But the truth was less poetic. These young women, often just 15 or 16, were terrified. They arrived by carriage, from foreign courts, barely fluent in the local tongue, handed off to husbands twice their age. Some bore bruises by the time they reached the altar. Others were beaten after the vows, in private chambers thick with tapestries, when no one heard them cry. What happened behind the drapery was not discussed openly, but rumors trickled through the palaces. Servants whispered, maids wept, priests turned their eyes away in the Habsburg courts, where bloodlines were sacred and deviation was treated like treason. Newlywed noblewomen were closely monitored for signs of rebellion or grief. One account from 1711 describes a teenage archduchess married into a German princely family who returned from her honeymoon with cracked ribs and silent eyes. She did not speak for 2 months, wrote a visiting courtier. She walked as if remembering pain with each step. Her mother had warned her, the story goes. Do not resist. He is your ruler now. He may break you, but he will not apologize. For noble houses, the ritualized cruelty served a darker function than just tradition. It was domination dressed in etiquette. Unlike peasant communities, where bridal beatings were justified through superstition or sin cleansing, noble violence was psychological theater, a power play. A warning in France, under the Ancien Regime, there were whispered phrases, le sang du mariage, the blood of marriage, and l'initiation au devoir, the initiation to duty. Some noble families staged the ritual, others kept it secret, known only to those within the household. But its existence was common knowledge. For a bride to flinch was expected. For her to resist was scandal. These were women raised in palaces, taught Latin and embroidery, diplomacy and dance, but none of their lessons prepared them for the wedding night that was less an embrace and more an assertion of ownership. In legal terms, they were married. In practical terms, they had been conquered. It was not just husbands who enforced this control. Mothers-in-law, elder aunts, even nuns, figures of religious and familial authorities, sometimes participated in breaking the bride. In 18th century Russia, a noble bride was secluded in a tower room for 2 days after the wedding, forced to read from religious texts as a form of purification. Servants reported bruises on her arms. When asked, she replied only, "I am being reshaped." Some of this brutality was symbolic, but not all. The emotional manipulation was very real. Aristocratic brides were warned that defiance would lead to exile, worse, annulment and disgrace. Their worth was tied to their purity, their silence, their ability to produce heirs. A broken bride was easier to control, and controlling her meant controlling everything she would birth. In the courts of Prussia and Austria, disciplinary instruction was sometimes written into marriage contracts, hidden among clauses about dowry amounts and succession rights. One document from 1768 specified that the groom had the right to correct the conduct of his wife in the manner befitting their station. That clause was enforced just 3 weeks later, when the bride refused to dine with a man rumored to be her husband's lover. She spent 5 nights locked in a linen closet. To an outsider, this may sound extraordinary, but to the families involved, it was routine. What mattered most was appearances. If the bride smiled at her presentation, if she bore children quickly, if she kept her bruises hidden beneath silk, the real tragedy, perhaps, was how many women accepted it, not because they didn't feel the pain, but because they were told it was necessary, that this was the price of elevation, of power, of being someone's wife. For some, the violence stopped after the wedding. For others, it became a pattern, a cycle dressed in velvet and pearls. They attended balls, hosted salons, painted smiles. But beneath the powder and perfume, many of them carried the invisible signature of a ritual that began with the phrase, "She must learn obedience." But what happens when obedience curdles interference? The marriage becomes not just a union, but a sentence. In the next section, we enter the private lives of these noble brides after the ceremony, uncovering how marriages founded on control and violence shaped entire generations of women into ghosts within their own homes. If the bride was the canvas, the groom was often the brush, tasked with shaping her into a wife, not through love, but through control. In the brutal tradition of bridal beatings, much has been written about the suffering of women, but the other half of the ritual, the bridegroom's role, reveals a darker blueprint of masculinity, forged through dominance and silence. In many communities, especially in Eastern Europe and the Balkans between the 16th and 18th centuries, the groom was not just a bystander. He was a participantor, at the very least, an overseer. The beating, whether symbolic or brutal, was his responsibility. It was his name the bride took, his household she entered, and his authority she was expected to submit to. Some family records from rural Romanian villages describe pre-wedding rituals where the groom was instructed by elders to test the bride's spirit. This might involve a slap, a command ignored and corrected with force, or more chillingly a moment of ritual humiliation meant to put her in her place. It was not seen as abuse, it was tradition. It was the man's duty. A 17th century journal from a Polish nobleman named Jan Leszek Rekers. Without emotion, the moment he was told to strike his bride the night before their wedding, his uncle, an aging warrior who had fought for the crown, handed him a birch switch and said, "Better she fears you now than resents you forever." Jan wrote only, "I did as told." She cried, but made no sound after. In some aristocratic houses, the ritual became more elaborate. The groom might not lift a hand himself, but he was expected to witness, to give permission, to nod silently, as elder women carried out the act of correction before the consummation. His compliance was part of his role as a man of the house. Refusing would raise suspicion. It would signal weakness. And weakness in a husband meant instability in the bloodline. Yet not all men complied willingly. Among the gentry and educated classes, Letters have survived, shaky, coded, pleading where grooms expressed horror at the expectations placed on them. In 1704, a young Prussian officer named Albrecht wrote to his sister days before his arranged marriage, "They have told me it is my task to discipline her, lest she believe herself equal. But she is 17, and I do not wish to strike someone who has never wronged me." His letter ends with a chilling line, "If I do not act, they will say I do not deserve her." This pressure to dominate was not only physical, it was psychological. In courts where masculinity was measured in control and silence, to express gentleness toward one's bride could be seen as disgraceful. Love was not a requirement, obedience was. And yet there were men who embraced the ritual, who took not just pride, but pleasure in it. Some family chronicles, especially in Hungarian noble houses, mention grooms who increased the severity of the punishment beyond what was expected, men who interpreted obedience as total submission. In one infamous case, Count Miklos Bathory ordered his bride's hair shaved on their wedding night after she failed to kneel quickly enough. He later told guests, "I have wed not a girl, but a servant of my house." For these men, violence was not merely tradition, it was confirmation of dominance. Their masculinity depended on fear, on the silence that followed a scream, on the flinch that came before a touch. But most grooms existed somewhere in between, trapped in the machinery of custom, unsure of how to resist without breaking the expectations of family, church, and society. For them, the ritual was neither pleasure nor cruelty. It was duty, a test of manhood that left many feeling hollow. One nobleman, writing in a private confession to his priest in 1722, lamented, "She trembled when I approached, and still I continued. I had no desire for her, only the desire to be done with it, and then I wept alone." These were not men without conscience, but they were men raised in a world where emotion was weakness, and power was proven through obedience enforced. For some, the ritual became a silent trauma, passed down like a family sword, unspeaking, but always present. And when sons grew into men, they remembered what their fathers had done, not because it was right, but because it was expected. In the next section, we turn away from the households of power and into the quiet rebellion of those who dared to say no. Brides who resisted, escaped, or refused to be broken. Their stories are rare, often tragic, but they mark the first cracks in a long, brutal tradition. Behind every grand procession, every garlanded arch and flickering candlelight, there was another space, one where joy was silenced and tradition took on a crueler shape. This was the room behind the ceremony, the chamber where the veil was not white but red-rimmed, where no music played, where the rituals were not spoken of later, not even in whispers. For centuries, these private ordeals were rarely recorded. Women, especially brides, had little access to the tools of memory, ink, paper, time. But when their voices surface, often in fragments and worn diaries, they reveal something the public stories could not, that the wounds left by these traditions went far deeper than bruises. They lingered in the soul, quiet and corrosive. In a tattered 18th century Czech diary preserved only because a descendant refused to burn it, we read the account of a young girl named Hannah. Her entry, dated the night before her wedding, is short and disoriented. "Today, mother said I must not cry, that to do so would shame her. She beat me with her palm and kissed my forehead after. She said, 'You'll thank me when he loves you for being soft.'" Hannah never mentioned the event again, but her next entry, written weeks later, ends with an odd line. The silence in me is a kindness to them. It wasn't always the groom who struck. In many households, especially among poorer or more devout families, the beating was entrusted to elder women, mothers, aunts, midwives. It was seen not as cruelty, but as inheritance, a ritual handed down like a recipe or a hymn. Women who had been struck now struck in turn, not out of hatred, but out of belief that this was the only way to prepare a daughter for the world that awaited her in Hungary. A rare testimony survives from the 1760s in the form of a spiritual journal kept by a village midwife named Erzsébet. In it, she writes, "I do not raise the stick in anger. I do it as my mother did. It is to remind her that pain is part of love. The world outside will not be gentle. Better she learns it from a hand that also holds her." The logic was tragic, yet common. Hurt them gently now, so they survived the brutalities later, but not all women accepted it. In some entries, especially those written in secret, a different voice emerges, a voice of quiet terror, or worse, numbness. A noble bride from Krakow, writing in 1711 under the pseudonym D., describes her ordeal in startling detail. "The room was lit by only one candle. My nursemaid held me by the arms. My mother did not speak. The blows were counted aloud by my aunt, 12, one for each month of submission. I did not cry, I did not scream. I floated above the ceiling, watching, a doll made of skin. My body hurt, but I felt nothing." This disassociation, this psychological fracture appears again and again. When the pain could not be resisted, it was often escaped from internally, a coping mechanism, a quiet rebellion of the mind when the body had no say. Some entries hint at emotional collapse in the days following. One girl, just 15, wrote, "They say I am a woman now, but I feel hollow like the flutes they played at the feast. He looks at me and I smile, but inside I am not there." And yet, even in this sea of sorrow, there are moments of resistance, not loud, not defiant, but deliberate. One account from a rural Orthodox village tells of a bride who locked herself in the grain cellar before her ritual could begin. Her father broke the door down and dragged her out. But the entry, written by her younger sister years later, ends with a line full of subtle pride. She spat on the floor before kneeling. That was her wedding gift to herself. Others resisted in smaller ways, refusing to speak for days after, refusing to kneel, refusing to weep. These were not open rebellions. They were muted refusals. And in the world they lived in, even silence could be a scream, for mothers, too. The ritual was not without its toll. Some diaries written by older women reveal guilt buried under layers of justification. One mother wrote, "I struck her, and she did not look at me again for a year. I told myself it was duty, but I asked the Lord if He will forgive me. Her silence is a knife in my days." These stories were not told aloud at feasts. They were not embroidered into wedding gowns or painted in church murals. They were hidden in drawers, tucked in hems, whispered to daughters only when the grandmothers were no longer listening. Behind the curtains, in the hush of those rooms, a different kind of history lived, one built not of wars and kings, but of wounds that never made it to record books. But some cracks began to form. A new generation of women educated, questioning, quietly enraged, began to see these rituals not as inheritance, but as injustice. They began to write more openly, to speak, if not aloud, then clearly enough for the future to hear, and it is from their words that we trace the next part of our story, the first signs of reckoning. Not with fists, but with ink. Not in ceremony, but in courts, reform circles, and the earliest tremors of resistance that threatened to shatter centuries of sanctioned cruelty. In the next section, we witness how the tide began to turn, not all at once, and not without backlash, but enough to change what it meant to become a bride, in the candlelit sanctity of ancient bedrooms and sanctuaries, where incense mingled with sweat and prayer. One symbol reigned above all: blood, not the blood of battle, not the crimson of martyrdom, but the quiet, personal blood of a girl on her wedding night. In countless corners of Eastern Europe, and far beyond, this crimson stain was not just expected, it was celebrated, revered, proof of purity, evidence of virtue, and perversely, a kind of blessing, whether drawn from the breaking of a hymen or from the bruising of ritual discipline. The presence of blood was seen as divine affirmation. The bride was intact, submissive, and ready. Folk songs whispered this truth in lullabies. Priests reinforced it from the pulpit. Midwives were trained not just in birthing, but in testing. It was not uncommon for a village to wait, hushed, as the wedding night passed. In the morning, linens were hung from balconies or handed to elders, still stained as a sign of honor. But if there was no blood, shame, accusation, sometimes exile. This is the twisted alchemy at the heart of this chapter of history, the transformation of violence into virtue, of wounding into proof of worth. Pain became the price of acceptance. In a Moldovan bridal manual from the late 1700s, preserved in a church archive, a priest wrote, "Let the red cloth be seen, for it is a bride's true dowry. It pleases God that her body be unopened before the joining, and that her pain be her offering." This wasn't only about virginity. In many communities, blood was demanded in advance through beatings. If a bride entered the marriage bruised or bleeding, it was said she had been properly prepared, that her body bore the lessons of obedience and humility. The logic was circular, but ironclad. Blood meant she had suffered. Suffering meant she was worthy. The horror deepens when we turn to first-hand accounts. In a Silesian family diary from 1733, a sister describes her elder sibling's wedding night. Mother said we must scrub her skin raw with salt beforehand, to purify her. Then she bled a little. We were glad, for the bedsheets might have shown nothing otherwise. Father smiled at the stains. I wondered if she smiled too, but she turned her face to the wall. In villages along the Carpathian border, hymen inspections were conducted by female elders with fingers calloused from generations of the same ritual. These matrons of virtue were charged with confirming purity before the wedding. If a girl was deemed to open, rumors would spread before the church bells even rang. Some girls, terrified of failing the test, injured themselves with thorns or pins. Better to draw one's own blood than face what came after. Even religious imagery supported this fetishization of female bleeding. In Orthodox and Catholic traditions alike, parallels were often drawn between the suffering bride and the Passion of Christ. One Romanian priest in the 18th century sermonized that as our Lord bore wounds for salvation, so too must the wife bleed for her new life. It was not just accepted, was sanctified. Yet beneath the rituals, the songs, the robes and rosaries, lived the silent dread of generations of women. In a handwritten note folded into the back of a prayer book, a young Polish bride wrote, "They pray for fruitfulness and grace. I pray not to scream when they check me. If I do not bleed, will he hate me? Will God?" There are scattered instances, rare but wrenching, where the bride's failure to bleed led to annulment or worse. Some were sent back to their families in disgrace. Others were accused of fornication, despite no evidence beyond a dry bedsheet. One 16-year-old from Serbia was drowned in a well by her in-laws after the wedding night produced no proof. The community later claimed she had deceived them with her eyes of innocence. To call this a culture of cruelty is not enough. It was a world where a woman's worth was weighed not in gold, but in red, where biology was weaponized, and anatomy became trial. But cracks eventually appeared in the doctrine by the 19th century. Some physicians began quietly challenging the assumptions. They pointed out that many women do not bleed during first intercourse and that hymens vary widely in shape and sensitivity. Some religious scholars, too, began to question the obsession with signs over spirit. Still, for many more decades, tradition would cling to its rituals, cloaked in sacred language, and through it all, women remembered, even when they didn't speak. One anonymous note found, sewn into a wedding corset, read, "It is not the blood that makes me a wife. It is the breath I hold and the words I swallow." That quiet refusal, like so many before it, marked the beginning of a shifter turning away from pain as a proof of purity. In the next section, we explore how these violent customs slowly began to lose their hold, how early reformers and women's advocates began to untangle suffering from sanctity, and how silence finally began to give way to voice. The cruelest traditions do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper. A hand placed too firmly on a daughter's shoulder, a warning given in the hush of dusk, a bruised bride led down the aisle by a woman who once stood in her place. In the pale light of generational memory, silence becomes its own inheritance. Across rural Romania, Ukraine, and the borderlands where history blurs into folklore, women who survived the old wedding rites carried their wounds into motherhood, not always with malice, often with a quiet logic forged from fear. This is what kept me safe. This is what made me a wife. This is how I survived, so they passed it down. In the early 20th century, long after the church had officially softened its stance, the rituals endured in kitchens and courtyards, behind lace curtains and locked bedroom doors. Anthropologists interviewing elderly women in the 1970s encountered stories not of anger, but of resignation. One Ukrainian woman, Maria, aged 86, told researchers, "My mother scrubbed me until I bled. She said it was for purity. She cried the whole time. I did the same to my daughter. I cried too. I didn't want to, but how else could I prepare her?" Maria wasn't cruel. She was terrified of shame, of her daughter being rejected, of being blamed herself if the marriage failed. So she repeated the ritual not out of hatred, but out of love twisted by generations of fear. This is how cruelty survives, not always through violence from above, but through whispers passed from mother to daughter, through the belief that suffering is strength, that endurance is virtue, that silence is safety. In many villages, there were no words for trauma, only sayings. A good wife does not speak of the wedding night. A bruise fades, a husband does not. What was done to you must not be undone. These mantras echoed in songs sung while braiding hair, in prayers muttered while stitching wedding dresses. The violence wasn't just hidden, it was woven into beauty, and so the daughters, even those who recoiled, often stayed silent, or worse, participated in a Romanian testimony recorded in 1983. A woman named Ileana, then in her 60s, recalled being urged by her mother to perform the pre-marriage preparation for her younger sister. She handed me the birch switch and said, "Better it come from love than from strangers." I hit her once, then twice. Then I went into the forest and vomited. What kind of love is this? A love that has been broken and reshaped by fear. A love filtered through centuries of warning. Do this or lose your place. Do this or die alone. Do this or dishonor your blood. And yet there were rebels even in whispers. Some mothers refused, some women ran. In small numbers, in hidden ways, they resisted, but most did not speak. To name the thing was to confront at hand. Few had the language or safety to do so. Silence became the shroud in which trauma was wrapped and handed down like an heirloom. And still it sat, folded, in drawers and hearts alike, even now. Some women recall their wedding nights, not in rage, but in confusion. One Ukrainian survivor said, "I thought everyone bled. I thought that was part of being loved. I didn't know until my granddaughter asked why I cried at her wedding." It took generations for the silence to crack. It took granddaughters who asked questions, women's collectives who dared to publish the truth, and so much time for the bruises to finally be named. But in these testimonies, handed down through trembling voices and tea-stained notebooks, we find a quiet kind of courage. Not every mother who stayed silent was complicit. Many were victims themselves, and in the deepest corners of their grief, perhaps they hoped without knowing how to end the cycle. Some prayed their daughters would bleed less, that their husbands would be kinder, that the ritual might soften. They were wrong, often, but not evil. They were bound, like their daughters, by the weight of unspoken survival, and yet, every silence broken now is a thread cut from that old, suffocating cloth. In the next and final section, we travel to the modern day to hear from those who are speaking out, reclaiming the stories, and finally laying these rituals to rest with something older than violence, truth. The echo of tradition is stubborn, clinging to walls long after the voices that gave it life have faded. The bridal beatings, once unquestioned, woven into the fabric of family, faith, and fear, did not disappear with the turning of a century. They faded slowly, reluctantly, like the last embers of a fire smouldering beneath cold ash. The dawn of the 20th century brought winds of change. Education crept into remote villages. Wars tore apart empires and social orders. New laws began to challenge ancient customs. Yet, the shadows of bridal beatings persisted, hidden beneath layers of shame and silence. Ethnographies traveling through Eastern Europe during the 1920s and 1930s recorded chilling remnants of the ritual. Their notes reveal a world still caught between archaic cruelty and the tentative steps of modernity. In a remote Romanian mountain village, one researcher documented a marriage where the bride was still beaten not by the groom, but by her mother-in-law, to teach her her place. The bride's tears were dismissed as weakness, and the act was explained as a custom that brings good fortune. When the ethnography asked what would happen if a bride refused, the villagers looked at her as though the question itself was blasphemy. Similar accounts emerged from the Carpathian foothills, where an elderly priest confessed privately that the wedding scourge was something he had tried to stop, but had no authority to prevent. He described families so steeped in tradition that even the church's attempts at reform were met with quiet defiance. Yet cracks were appearing. The brutality once cloaked in religious sanctity and cultural necessity was beginning to be questioned not only by outsiders, but by the communities themselves. In towns touched by education, by women reading newspapers and hearing new ideas on the radio, the ritual became harder to justify. Women, once resigned to their fate, began to see the violence for what it was, a legacy of fear and control, not love or purity. One letter from a young Ukrainian woman, dated 1934, survives in an archive. She writes to a feminist circle in Kyiv, "My mother told me it was the way of our people, but I say it is a way of broken souls. I will marry soon. I refuse the beating. If my family disowns me, I will find my own path." Her courage was rare, but emblematic of a slow, unraveling dot in parallel. Legal reforms began to chip away at the social acceptance of such practices. Governments, newly anxious to project modernity, outlawed domestic violence in theory, though enforcement in rural areas remained inconsistent for decades. The post-World War II era accelerated change. Socialist governments promoted gender equality, rhetorically discouraged backward customs, and encouraged education for women. Television and radio broadcasts brought images and ideas from cities to villages that had barely seen electricity. But the silence was not easily broken. Older women still recounted the old ways in hushed tones. Mothers-in-law passed down the same warnings, now tempered with fear of law and social scrutiny. The ritual's outward form faded, but its psychological grip lingered in many places. The physical beatings gave way to verbal discipline, harsh words, threats, cold silences. The intent was the same: to remind the bride of her place, to ensure obedience. The new generation may not have borne bruises, but they carried scars nonetheless. Anthropologists visiting Eastern European villages in the 1950s and 60s noted that while the violence was no longer as visible, the underlying patriarchal control was deeply entrenched. Brides still spoke of fear, not just of husbands, but of the family honor that could be lost with a misstep. Even as the physical rituals dwindled, the symbolism endured. The stained sheets, once displayed proudly, became secret. The hymen, once a public proof, became a whispered concern. And the pressure on brides to submit silently completely remained. But slowly, something profound was changing. Education gave women new voices. Urban migration offered escape. Legal protections, however flawed, provided grounds for challenge. The rituals, once unthinkable, became stories told by grandmothers' haunting memories, not prescriptions. And yet, the reckoning with what those rituals truly meant, the trauma, the loss of agency, the complicity, was far from complete. The ritual's shadow still touches many lives today, a reminder of how deeply culture can wound under the guise of tradition. As this chapter of history fades, it leaves behind a question that haunts descendants and historians alike. How do societies heal from traditions born in pain? How do we untangle respect from cruelty when they have been so tightly bound? In the final section, we explore the legacy of these bridal beatings, the survivors who speak out, the historians who bear witness, and the ongoing journey to reclaim stories once silenced. In the quiet corners of museums and forgotten family homes, relics linger, wedding dresses preserved beneath glass, untouched for centuries. Their fabric is delicate, once pure, now faded. Some bear stains, not of time, but of blood, a silent testament to pain hidden behind the veil of celebration. These dresses are echoes of a brutal past, reminders that history does not vanish, it sometimes hides in plain sight, folded into lace and whispered prayers. The bridal beatings we have traced are more than an archaic cruelty. They are a story of wounds unseen, both on skin and soul. The physical bruises faded long ago, but the psychological scars remained into generations of women who bore them silently, often without words, and sometimes without hope. What does it mean, then, to carry such a legacy? How many daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters have stepped into marriage bearing invisible burdens? How many lives have been shaped, constrained, or broken by rituals few dared to name? The answer is impossible to quantify, but the echoes ripple through history like a haunting refrain. Psychologists today recognize the trauma woven into such traditions. The fear instilled, the enforced submission, the dissociation many brides described all speak to a cultural wound deep and enduring. These women were not simply victims of violence, they were captives of silence, trapped in cycles where love was measured by endurance rather than affection. Yet within this silence, there was also resilience. Some survived by retreating inward, creating inner sanctuaries where pain could be weathered. Others found small ways to resist through secret letters, whispered confessions, or quiet refusals. Their strength was not always visible, but it was real, and it laid the groundwork for change. Today, as scholars, survivors, and descendants reclaim these stories, the veil is lifting. The rituals once hidden in shame are being confronted with honesty and empathy. In villages where these customs once thrived, new generations gather not to repeat, but to remember, to honor those who suffered, and to ensure the cycle ends. One survivor, now an elder in her community, describes the transformation. Simply, we carry the wounds, yes, but now we tell the stories. We do not hide, and in telling we begin to heal. The wedding dress, blood-stained yet preserved, is no longer just a symbol of pain. It becomes a testament to survival, a mirror held up to history's darkest corners. It asks us to look closely, to acknowledge what was endured, and to remember those whose voices were once silenced. Because history is not only the tale of kings and battles, it is also the story of everyday lives shaped by customs both beautiful and brutal, and sometimes the greatest wounds are the ones no one saw. As the glass reflects the past, we must ask ourselves, what other stories lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered? What other legacies have shaped us in silence? This is not a story closed. It is an invitation to listen, to learn, and to bear witness.